Hello guys. All right, today we're going to be looking at the Mongols and the bubonic plague. And in order to really examine the impacts and what happened with the bubonic plague, you have to actually look at the Mongols first, because as it often happens in world history, when you have the creation of new major connections and societies that end up meeting and interacting and engaging, outbreaks of epidemic diseases often follow, because you have a whole host of people that are exposed to various diseases that they had not been before and did not have immunities to. And so we see this pattern happen on a regular basis. So in order to understand and get to the bubonic plague, you have to first look at the Mongols. So we're going to start there with the Mongols and look at a little bit of their background, and understanding with that you have these three aspects of trade, conquest, and travel, all which create cultural connections. As well as the basis or background, we'll say background, for disease, for spread of disease. All right, so it's within this basis that we're going to end up with the bubonic plague. And not that the Mongols are the sole reason for it, but it certainly opened up the world and created a literal connection of cross-cultural trade and travel and conquest that allowed for the disease to spread as much as it did and become so devastating in that process. So if we're looking at when the Mongols started, they were semi-nomadic, which means that they were not sedentary. They moved around. Nomadic, if you're purely nomadic, then you constantly moved around. Nomadic cultures are usually hunting and gathering societies who followed migration patterns of the animals because that was their food. Semi-nomadic usually relies on a mix of agriculture and hunting and gathering, and moves largely seasonally, because they are not seasonal movement. They are not fully reliant on agriculture. Therefore, while they may use it or gather it or take it, it isn't something that fully supports a large population if you aren't 100% an agricultural-based society. And this has to do just with the land requirements of what is necessary for providing. So in like a hunting and gathering, just to give you an idea, in a hunting and gathering society, the land requirements are that one person requires 1 to 2.5 square miles of land. Okay, now agriculture, right, the farming, you have 100 people are supported by 1 square mile, which is why this is what creates, right, urban centers, cities, and all of that. All right, so that's extremely important for understanding density and population and why you can stay in one place. So how that gets us back to semi-nomadic is that they were not fully agriculture, they were not fully hunting and gathering, they were somewhere in between. And so that gets you back to having to move with the seasons, because while the land does support more than a hunting and gathering society, it doesn't support as much as a fully agricultural based society. Life was hard within the Mongol tribes, and they were broken up into tribes, into several tribes. And it's only later that they're going to, under Genghis Khan, be unified. And life was hard. You had to be of a hardy mix to survive, and that certainly was brought up in the culture that this impacted the cultural aspect of society, that they were expected to be warriors and strong and tough. Those who were not often ended up dying. And that was kind of the structure of the society. They lived off of hunting and animal herding, livestock herding, and some collection of various agricultural goods. They didn't stay in one place too long to really do large-scale agriculture, but as they're going to conquer other areas, they would often have others do it for them. So this actually became a form of tribute from conquered nations. They would provide the Mongols with the grains and other things that they needed. So when you have this type of structure in life, one of the areas in focus that it was on military. Military was a huge aspect of their society. They were always on the march, always expected to be basically a standing army, a perpetual standing army, always ready to fight, always well ready and trained to do so. Of course, this does create what's considered in many cases a professional military. And the thing with a professional military during this time is a lot of societies didn't have their whole entire society based upon this perpetual readiness for warfare, and that certainly is going to serve the Mongols well as they start to conquer. They used heavy compound bows and were very good on horses. In fact, they had horses that had specific saddles that allowed them not only to stand up, but be maneuverable, turn around, and fire their bow from multiple angles. And so this kept them actually highly proficient at attacking on horseback and being far superior with their bow skills compared to many other societies. They also were known for having multiple horses so that you could ride over 70 miles a day by simply switching out a tired horse and moving on. To give you an example of this, here is an image with the Mongols, and if you look up images of them, a lot of the times what you do see is on horseback, right? This is the emphasis because this is how they attacked, this is how they fought. Here you can see the compound bow and attacking with the bow. A better example even of the maneuverability of this was here you have the saddle, and he's turned around, and so that they would actually rest their feet in the stirrups that allowed them, because they were specially made so they could actually stand up or partially stand up, easily maneuver around, shoot from behind, shoot from the side, and then continue forward. And this was by far a superior tactic to a lot of other armies at the time, and made them highly successful in expansion in that process. So this was the standard of Mongol warriors, certainly what they're known for and feared for, because many really couldn't compete with them in that matter. Now, as far as the tribal structure goes, let's see, we're here. Again, when they started, they were independent, loosely independent. They weren't fully independent. So loosely independent tribes that certainly identified as Mongol, but weren't working together in that sense. And within these tribes, you had kingship and familial tribes. So you had the various kings And then familial relations, often the tribes were based on extended family groups that were largely working together because of being extended family, and you had loose alliances with the other tribes there. Women played an important role in Mongol society, both with, of course, marriage, as well as within, of course, the day-to-day activities that were needed, such as taking care of the children, milking livestock, shearing animals, processing pelts. They did all the daily work of the tribes that was necessary. Now, with marriages, alliances were very common. Alliances with women is something that has been around forever in history. And alliances were often set up to help the individual family and or tribe. And while women technically in that sense had very little say in who they were married to, because they were designed for political alliance over any type of love relationship, women still did have the right to own property and divorce. Which are huge things in most cultures. I mean, really until the 1900s, where, you know, that was something women didn't have the right or option to do. So it was this weird mix of certainly being used for alliances within a marriage, and yet having the rights to property and divorce, which gave them some autonomy and agency within the society itself. So the Mongols needed grazing lands and certainly sought out fertile lands for their livestock, and then ended up depending on the settled people for the grains and manufactured goods, right? Because that's why they ended up staying semi-nomadic, because they didn't settle down long enough to produce their own agriculture, and instead relied on those that they conquered to do so. Now, they end up being united, all of the tribes, under Genghis Khan, who makes them not only the largest but most fearsome fighting force between him and then his sons. And this is then where you get massive expansion that takes place and really connects the world under Genghis Khan and a unified Mongol sense. Because you had individual tribes that expanded and conquered and took areas before, but it's once that they're all unified under one group that they actually have a significant impact on the rest of the world. And so they end up expanding across China, Afghanistan, and all the way to Persia. And so that had a massive impact on that area of the world, and even reaching further, because it opened up trade routes and opportunities for people in Europe and other areas to interact and engage with trade. And it created all of this, like I said, creates this vast network of trade, which is incredibly important, not only for cultural transfusion and experiences, but ultimately creating this aspect of connectivity along the world that didn't exist before, and is going to open up for the bubonic plague to easily be transferred to various areas across the world, because so many people after Mongol expansion under Genghis Khan and then his sons are now connected in a way that they had not been before. So what happens with that then is you have, like I said, this exploration and growth through the Mongol Empire that allowed for most likely the bubonic plague to spread, at least a lot faster than it would have otherwise. When you have borders that are closed off, when you have people that aren't expanding and trading through ship, through land, through goods, right, then it would take longer for the disease to get to different areas and cross, these invisible borders. But because the Mongols opened that up, it ultimately allowed for a much more rapid expansion of the plague. And just to give you an idea of how much they opened up a significant area of the world, The map here shows the expansion in different areas, as well as movements of Genghis Khan. So these large red lines here, these are all movements of Genghis Khan and his generals, which shows how far and overreaching that they traveled. And then you have the different levels of, here's the early empire, and then the limits of the empire as their control and influence in the region. And with this, then you have a vast network of trade routes that emerge from this empire, which allows for massive connection of these different areas and societies. And that's, again, where we'll see the bubonic plague follows, was these trade routes and routes that the Mongols had opened up in that process. And here you can see, well, it doesn't show all of the exact trade routes and stuff as far as how it continued to spread and move out further and further from different periods and dates, from 1347 all the way to 1351. And that both overland trade as well as ship trade played a role in this development. So with the bubonic plague then, you have what is believed to not only, the common saying is that they came over on rats, and there is a connection to the rats with the fleas. So what you have is that I believe is from the steppe area that you had the emergence of the plague initially, and then from this, what happens is that you end up with the fleas that they believe bit and traveled on the rats, that then were transferred by ship and overland trade routes. And then from there, you have fleas that bite other people, that are transmitting the disease itself, as well as very quickly that moves from that basis to, of course, transmission by humans. So first by fleas and then by humans. Within the symptoms there, it was easy to, coughing, contact, a variety of easy ways to bodily fluids that transmitted the diseases. And so this flea bite inserts into the bloodstream of the rodents, and then anything else that it can reach in the process. Now with the bubonic plague, there were two other forms that emerged, and we'll look at the characteristics and structure as well. But so let's see, the two other forms that emerged. So you have the bubonic plague, which was the basic plague, which could be deadly in of itself, and then you had the pneumonic plague, which was what spread to your lungs like pneumonia. And so this created coughing and hacking up blood, which of course was another way that then it could be transmitted, and often even created connection to skin contact, although the regular bubonic plague did so as well. The pneumonic plague was more deadly than the basic form of bubonic plague, and then the most deadly form of it was the septicemic plague, which is where it's the septic, right? It's where you go septic, it goes in your bloodstream, and once it infects the bloodstream, it's fatal. So while you do have a chance of recovery with the regular bubonic plague and the pneumonic plague, if it goes to the bloodstream, it was 100% fatal. at that point. Although the pneumonic plague, again, was much higher fatality rate than just the generic aspect of the bubonic plague. So what were the conditions and different characteristics of what happened once someone was infected? Usually a person was infected within a few days. They start showing symptoms. So let's put the infected here. What you get is that within 1 to 3 days, depending on the type, you begin to show symptoms. And early symptoms would be swelling in the lymph nodes, which were often called the bubos, that were often these kind of black, what would look like big black boils essentially on the skin. These often were around 2 parts, which was the armpits and groin to start, but often spread quickly from there. But those were the earliest areas of where you would see it. And then you would have vomiting of blood. Besides, of course, the buboes would also have leak pus and liquid, which all of this stuff here was then more likely to transmit it to other people. Right? You have the various bodily fluids that made it more contagious within that process. The mortality rate of the bubonic plague, again, depended with the basic bubonic plague. You had a variety of ranges depending on conditions, 35 to 80%. Whereas with the pneumonic plague, you had you had about 90%. So it was pretty deadly in of itself. 90%. And then again, with once it gets into the bloodstream, you're at 100% mortality rate. So most of the people who survived with the regular basic bubonic plague, not the more extreme versions. This obviously, though, did impact based on any of these numbers on where you lived. So higher populated areas such as cities were more likely to have a higher effect on mortality rates. And not just because, of course, it was population, but also because you had closer contact with people. Cities were at this period in time pretty dirty, a lot of the cities, and you also have a large area and grouping of poor people, which leads to worse nutrition, all of which was likely to add to the possibility of death or likelihood of death. So the idea of a large number of population, which equals close contact, more likely to get it from someone at that point. Any type of dirty or unclean conditions, and then of course with poor populations. There we go. Populations. This usually was connected to worse nutrition in food, and this was more likely to mean that you were likely to die from it, just because you didn't have the nutrition or healthiness to fight off the disease versus someone who was in a cleaner area that wasn't getting infections, even if they did get the plague, and then had a healthier diet that would allow them to survive. So from there, let's look at how it spread and influenced various aspects of the world. Spread of the plague. And then we'll look at people's reactions and structure after that. So the expansion of steep trade under Mongol rule is mostly believed from where it started in northern caravan routes in the late 1320s. So that is where, again, it's not worldwide initially. You have this kind of localized region, but because of the expansion of this trade and caravan routes, that you have this access to other parts of the world that prior to the Mongols wouldn't have been as easily accessible. And then from there, the first place that it was found and then spread to was China. Outbreaks began, nope, don't want to do that. Outbreaks began in 1330, where it was began to be written about and noticeable on a larger scale in the 1330s, and continued on and off for 15 years. And ended up killing millions of people. So what would happen is that you'd have these outbreaks that would last for a couple years, and then it would begin to die down. And really, just when people thought it had finally ended, it would flare up again, and then die down, and then flare up, and so on for 15 years. So it wasn't 15 years straight. That probably would have completely wiped out the entire population, but instead was these flare-ups on and off for 15 years. And part of the reason why China was so impacted from this is that the previous Song dynasty and the Mongol rule, both of these, had ended up creating a significantly larger population increase in China. And remember, we talked about that one of the things with this that happens is that when you have the larger populations, you're more likely to have it spread and continue to spread at a faster rate. The problem was that on top of this, you had low resources. So there were periods of time prior to the bubonic plague, and then of course during, where they had problems with resources, specifically of course with access to food, which made the population vulnerable, and this ultimately impacted the long-standing flare-ups that continued. What happened with this, of course, in China is that one of the things, it decimated the Mongols' claim to rule in China, and we'll look at how the larger consequences and how it changes nations and states after the recovery. But ultimately, one of the things that China had was the mandate from heaven. And the mandate from heaven set up that whoever was basically in charge had been given the mandate from heaven to rule. And it was created a long time ago with the Zhou kingdom, in order to justify overthrowing the Shang dynasty. Well, actually, so it created by the Shang dynasty to overthrow the priest dynasty, and the Zhou used it as well, and it was used thereafter. And it was basically set up like, here's what a good king is, here's what a bad king is, and if you're a bad king, then you'll lose the mandate of heaven, and if you lose the mandate of heaven, then you aren't in a position where you should be ruling. So what happened then, of course, is that when you have this devastating disease, it ultimately destroyed any claim that the Mongols had used to have the Mandate of Heaven to control China, which is what they'd used as a form of propaganda to essentially assert control in that region. But once you have this bubonic plague, decimating everyone, it's easy to claim, well, clearly heaven isn't happy with you. They obviously no longer support your rule, which of course made it easier for the collapse of the Mongol Empire, besides the fact that they were also decimated with the disease and couldn't hold on to it. So with a combination of then this Mandate of Heaven and propaganda, it's going to allow for the decline and ultimately end of Mongol rule in China. Then the other thing that you have is just the large populations, and one province, they had like 90% of the population by the 1350s was killed. And so it certainly created significant losses in certain regions. And this is going to be the same everywhere. But when you have large farming populations impacted by the plague, the problem that happens with this, right, is then you have less food production. And we already saw the problem that happens when you have less food production. And this also helped create the problem of the 15 years of flare-ups, is that it's really hard to come back from this, as it took years and years, because you not only have people dying, you have then the entire economy and system of food production and government and religious structures all crumble around it. And we'll see this with each society, and how they react and what they do, it varied between each society. For China, they actually had what was called the Red Turban Movement. And the Red Turban Movement was essentially a blending of China's various religious beliefs, and kind of in a sense of trying to suggest that we need to get back to our religious beliefs, and look at, understand them, learn them, appreciate them. And it was that the Mongols had moved them away from understanding and learning these religious beliefs in the past, and so that played a role in it. And we'll see religion is something that constantly comes up in that process, as either looking to it or rejecting it, depending on the situation. So one of the movements in China was, again, this Red Turban Movement, which was to blend together China's various religious beliefs, to refocus back on China's religion, and trying to overthrow all that was like the Mongol way. Its leaders emphasized strict diet, and various restrictions on what type of food that they were allowed to eat. So there was certain food that they had restrictions on. They were supposed to basically do penance and ceremonial rituals to cleanse themselves and the area, and kind of in a form of right, that they're, because of the fact that they had rejected and fallen under Mongol rule, that this was, somehow a punishment towards that. So they needed to do penance. They needed to be strict on their dietary, what they ate, as well as perform the rituals in order to try to, have this end. Ultimately, the Red Turban Movement was a little bit more dire in their end belief, which was that they often made proclamations that the world was ending. And that kind of fatalistic outlook was not uncommon around the world. So from China, 2, sort of 3 now, it moved to the Islamic world. And it broke out in a couple different areas. One of the ways that it spread in 1347 had to do with early germ warfare, which the Mongols participated in. They were besieging a city that was a port on the Crimea Peninsula in 1347, and they had been infected with the plague, and they had their soldiers that had died. And so what they did is they actually ended up catapulting the bodies of those who had died from the plague into the city. So through infected bodies over the city walls. And this not only infected the city, but at the same time, they actually traced back that one of the ships leaving the city, right at the port, ended up carrying the plague to Egypt, and then continued onward. So that this one ship that they tracked ended up passing along the bubonic plague in part. Again, it wasn't the whole thing, to a lot of different cities. So Egypt around 1347, and from there it spread to Damascus, Jerusalem, Mecca, and coastal areas through West Africa. And this was part of the Islamic heartland. And you ended up having it go until it reached Baghdad as well in 1347. And this ended up causing thousands and thousands of deaths in Baghdad alone. One of the things that was mentioned a lot within the Islamic world was that animals were also affected. And it wasn't just in the Islamic world, but you do have a lot more sources talking about it. That the animals could be infected as well, which of course, this not only is pets, right, but livestock, which impacts, again, right, if we go back to it, food production, which just creates this whole cycle of more people sick. So it just is a continual cycle of problem within the plague and the infection of hampering people's recovery, not only because of how fast it spread, but how, again, the more deadly versions of the bubonic plague that ended up killing people far more. But then also the fact that it just impacts productivity, and then the actual animals as well, that you need to have better food. And if you don't have good food, you're more likely to get sick and die. This left the Islamic State in basically near political and economic collapse. And it's going to actually, what we'll see with this, right, just like China, who then overthrew the Mongols in their weakened state and took back over. The Islamic nation is going to have to reorganize themselves and change, because the older Islamic system doesn't collapse completely, but ends up pretty close to it. One of the quotes from an observer who was traveling around said that cities and buildings were laid waste, roads and way signs were obliterated, settlements and mansions became empty, dynasties and tribes grew weak. And it was often described as this utter wasteland in many areas of the Islamic world. And then the other place that we're going to look at is Europe. So Europe, which often is kind of seen as being impacted the most, and certainly produced a lot more of responses and reactions to the plague, but they definitely were very much impacted by it. It first reached Italy in late 1347. Again, from that ship, it broke out in a port. And so the ships, right, and the various trading routes via sea definitely played a huge role in spreading the disease. It was not just overland. And in fact, you know, arguably the ships were what allowed it to spread significantly faster than if it had just been overland travel. And from there, so right, the ship that had left the Crimea Peninsula and had gone to Egypt and transferred stuff there ended up in Italy as well and spread the disease. From there, you end up with in France in 1348. And then you have England by the end of the year of 1348. And then you have from England, it went to Germany in 1349, and Russia by 1351. In Europe, around 50% of the population died from the disease. So again, far more impacted in deaths and actually just devastation in Europe because you have around at least 50% of the population died, which they estimate to be around 25 to 30 million people, not just in Europe, but actually around the world that died. And while not every area experienced 50% of the population, I think worldwide it also rounded out to be about 50% of the population as well in the regions that were impacted. So it was devastating in the sense of having such a massive drop in people for not only what you could produce, but just the amount of time it takes to recover from that is extensive. As you can see, with it raging on and off for 15 years in China, it was not a quick turnaround from when it started hitting with the disease to when societies were able to begin recovery. And the fact that they continued to come back until longer than 15 years, to 1450 in some areas. And there are areas that were left with less than a quarter of the population remaining by the end when it finally died out completely. So what we want to look at now is the reactions to the plague. And I think 4 now with that. Because there we looked at a few reactions, but we want to look at some more of the various reactions and responses to the devastation, because it did vary, and Europe definitely experienced quite a few different reactions. It depended on the wealthy versus the poor, and of course the church's reaction as well. The wealthy, often, if they could, especially when they realized that, of course, your wealth didn't prevent you from not getting this disease, often fled to the countryside. Not that that always helped them, but the idea, of course, being getting out of the city, which left the poor remaining. Others turned to debauchery and orgies and entertainment. The idea of what living it up, if you will, that you should enjoy yourself before you die. You know, and this certainly had a fatalistic tone to it. You know, like the Red Turban group that had a fatalistic tone, although theirs became much more strict. This was, you might as well enjoy your life because everyone's going to die. Others did turn to religion and then found themselves disappointed with it. Others became more strict. So there was disappointment with the feeling the clergy had failed them, and that now some of largely this was the Catholic Church, and you had some that stayed and ended up getting sick themselves because of helping and nurturing and doctoring those that were sick. But you had plenty of clergy who fled the different areas and abandoned what people felt that they were abandoned from them. And so you do have many that actually moved away from religion, or actually began asserting the idea of rejection of Catholic practices and looking towards themselves for understanding religion and being religious. However, there were others that became stricter within their religious beliefs and practices, with either being super observant. There was also flagellation with whipping yourself, where we have, let me show you those, come back to, so this was a common practice actually that emerged to those who became more religious, which was this belief of inflicting pain and suffering as a way of penance, and was often attributed to being significantly more strict and religious. And they had these whole groups that would walk along the city streets, chanting and whipping themselves in public in an attempt to gain penance and forgiveness. And so this kind of procession here, and there's the whips, right? They're not, it's showing them just barely. It's why their shirts, right, or the little cloaks here are not full shirts, because, and here's the blood, they were whipping themselves. And then you had people that were walking in front, and they would walk through the town. And this was seen as the stricter version of religious beliefs, and specifically attempting to stop worldly pleasures. And again, it was also a form of penance in that sense. So you had either those who completely went towards worldly pleasures and looked for living it up, or you had the others that then completely followed strict rules and guidelines, walked through the towns in these processions, whipping themselves on a regular basis, and saw that it was the only way. With essentially they attached this to sin, and said, right, that people had sinned, and it was only through stricter practices and following this penance that Europe and others would recover. You also had the doctors, which is this where it creates these masks. So the mask, they would actually put various herbs and other items into the beak of the mask, which this was meant to be a filter, right, for the disease. And the idea was the stick, not only to potentially bring stuff over, but to you could poke the person to see if they were dead and inspect without having to touch. They wore gloves, but it does create the plague doctors create this very creepy essence of which they use in horror films and other things later on in life. And they often were sometimes called Dr. Death, because of course so many people dying from the plague, the doctors go see them and then they die, even though that's not an association. Now these masks, whether they helped a little bit, maybe they certainly would have helped prevent if like you coughed up bodily fluids or blood and not getting it in your mouth. But the idea of this filtering much was not super successful. It certainly creates a creepy feel in the process though. But so this became a commonplace sight in towns in Europe, where doctors would have these full coverings and gloves to try to protect themselves and not have any open spots where they could get fluid, which is not necessarily, that's not unsound advice. And then these very specific stylized masks, which were believed and hoped to filter out. And each doctor kind of stuffed the beak of it with different things that they believed would help prevent disease spreading to them. And then what you also get, which I had you look with your discussions, and I'm going to do a little separate recording to go over the individual sources and images and talk about those briefly. So we'll get a little more into reactions and responses and treatment when we go over those. And so definitely check that out because while I'm going to respond to people's discussion board questions, I can't respond to everyone's individually. And so wanting to make sure that you are on the right track with that, you want to make sure you listen to the primary source discussions as well to make sure that you got the ideas you were supposed to get out of it. It's also kind of a good summary of that. So don't forget when that does get posted to check that out. But there is a lot of imagery during this period too of the scenes of the hospitals, of people being treated, and everywhere you walked. So, I mean, hospital loosely, right? You have this building area here where this man is laying down and he's being treated, another person walking through, and here you've got, again, we're talking about animals, everything, that here implying, right, that everything falls victim to the plague, that there's nothing that escapes its grasp. And that was one of the things that they struggled with, all the societies around the world, is like, how do you deal with this brutal disease that seems to attack everyone and anyone, infants to the old, to the everyone in between, wealthy and poor, kings to peasants, holy men to those who were sinners. It didn't matter. Anyone could fall victim to it, and including the animals. And it was psychologically devastating. Besides the physical impact that we talked about with the lack of population, which of course means lack of production, which means lack of food production, and then thus lack of food for people, you have a psychological component that people have to deal with too. Everyone had people that died around them from this disease. If you survived, you were, the more unique experience in that sense. And dealing with the loss of all of your family, dealing with the loss of the town that became almost like a ghost town, people rearranging and changing their expectations of how they interacted with people. And this wasn't just in Europe, this was around the world, as people were being impacted by the disease. How they interacted with each other, how they saw the world, how their towns changed both psychologically and physically, was something that was very difficult to deal with because they hadn't seen disease on this level before. And so like I said, that's why those primary sources I had you look at were so important, is because it shows some of those reactions and how people trying to understand and come to grips with, looking at how it can take anyone, how their children are dying, how everything around seems to collapse in death and gore. And that does leave a mark on the psyche of the people as they're rebuilding. And this is one of the things that is going to create as a consequence, is that you have all these regimes that were in control. The Mongols, especially, but others within the Islamic world, which was very much in the older standard structure of as Arab speaking, very much a connection back to Muhammad, of this idea of a certain world order that collapses, and while the Islamic world through the Ottoman Empire and others reemerges, it adapts and evolves, just like China overthrowing the Mongols and adapting and evolving based on that and how they build, and Europe as well. And so that plays an important role with these nations looking to strengthen their military, looking to reestablish a strong and strict control of kingship through military might, and affirm their strength through expansion, which is going to lead us to the global exploration, specifically with the oceanic explorations that emerge and culminates with Columbus and subsequent individuals. But prior to Columbus, you have that China, that's going to have their famous treasure ships that we'll look at, and exploration, as well as several others that begin trying to show off their power and their control, as well as, you know, begin to trade and examine the world again. And that happens because of the significant changes and collapsing empires because of the plague. So that's where we're going to stop for now, and we will look at how the nations change, oceanic exploration, leading up to then Columbus and influences into discovering the Americas, and the connections between the world and the Americas next time.